Hey, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, and welcome to TV Skywriter. I'm Pat Murray. Now, I publish the Durham Skywriter, which is Durham, North Carolina's online community paper. But with TV Skywriter, I'd like to introduce you to people from everywhere, like cool people that I want you to know about. So if you'd ever like to be a guest, you don't have to worry about not being from North Carolina because my next guest is in New York City. So we're going to talk about media with Cheryl Thompson-Morton from the Center for Community Media, and that is housed by CUNY's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. CUNY is the City University of New York, if I'm not mistaken. She can correct me if I'm wrong. So let's start the show and bring on Cheryl Thompson-Morton. Hey, it's time for TV Skywriter. Hello, Cheryl. How are you?
I'm good, Pat. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. This is a great Sunday night. In fact, I got a little carried away. I was a little late sending you the link because this is a very sad story. I know you know about the search for the young lady out in, I think, Wyoming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they just found her body. And I always am fascinated by how media handles extemporaneous speech, not using a script, how they handle the news. So I got carried away watching that. So I do apologize for being a little late.
Oh, no, you're totally fine. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Absolutely. Now, you are with the Center for Community Media.
Yeah.
I was alerted to the existence of that organization because I got an email inviting me to take part in to participate or attend rather the Black Media Initiative Exchange. But first, why don't you tell us what the Center for Community Media is all about?
Yes. So the Center for Community Media has been around in various iterations for around 20 years. And its
Oh,
goal is really to support what we call community media, which is really niche media. So media serving ethnic audiences, media serving, smaller communities. Think of it as places that may not be or communities that may not be big enough to have their own newspaper,
mhm.
but they are communities that still need specific types of news and information. And so the center has mainly focused for the majority of its time on New York City and supporting the community media organizations in New York. But recently, we've expanded our work nationally through the Latino Media Initiative and then the Black Media Initiative, which I run, which aims to support Latinx and Black media throughout the country to be more financially sustainable and do the best work to serve our communities.
Okay, if you don't mind, I have two quick questions.
Yes.
I'm just curious about New York. I'm from Chicago, where there are dozens of publications. I mean, literally, there's like quite a few Black publications,
Yeah.
Puerto Rican, Mexican, African, Caribbean, Jewish, LGBT, Vietnamese, Chinese. That's all I've seen. I'm sure
Yeah.
there's more. So I'm curious, do you happen to know how many publications are in New York City? I guess I shouldn't say New York City. I mean, New York, the five boroughs.
Yeah, the five boroughs.
Yeah.
I mean, we have in our directory somewhere over 300 of those community organizations. So
In
that
New
ranges,
York, 300.
yeah, in throughout the five boroughs. So that ranges from, you know, Black throughout the diaspora,
Mhm.
Latino, Asian, um, religious. So there's a Jewish
Mhm.
population of hyperlocal sites, other religious groups, and hyperlocals like
Mhm.
Brooklyn. The sites that specifically serve certain communities of Brooklyn or different areas. So yeah, we have a list of about 300 in the five boroughs.
That's amazing. So when the Center for Community Media started, did it start out with the with CUNY, the City University of New York,
No,
or was it
no.
a
So actually, the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism is only 15 years old.
okay?
So actually, our like original center, which was under different names, it kind of did different things, but
Mhm.
the bones of it is what has carried throughout the 20 years. Actually predates the school, but at some point. the organization kind of was going through a transition and needed some
Mhm.
support. And so our now dean actually brought the center into the school to provide that support
Yeah.
for us to be able to continue to do our work and to kind of reiterate who we were and how we serve communities.
So that was a while back. I know you just joined last year, at least or this year.
Yeah, like 3 months ago.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you know the history. Do you know how it happened to start? Do you think it was some publications they got together and tried to help each other, or what?
I'm not entirely sure what got it started. I think it was a group of people who formerly worked at publications and saw
Mhm.
that what was happening. A lot of places were closing up shop because this is around the time when we're starting to see changes in the business model of how newspapers, which most community media are newspapers
Mhm.
at that
Mhm.
time, especially because we weren't in this age of social media and things like
Right.
that, made their money via advertising and classifieds. And this was kind of the time of Craigslist starting
Oh
to come into the
yeah. Is that
fore,
still
right?
around?
Hmm?
Is
Craigslist is
Craigslist?
still around. It still exists.
Okay, because I know they took a lot of business from the
They
newspaper.
did. They gutted newspapers, and this was pre Google and Facebook figuring out their revenue models,
Mhm.
and being able to target and advertising in the world in the way that newspapers could never do. And so places started to kind of close up, and I think a group of those folks started to say, how can we support um, these media organizations so that we don't see the mall, slowly close down and us
Mhm.
lose this very important part of our community that archives our stories, and archives history that even we're seeing in modern day. If it wasn't for community media, Black media, Latino
Mhm.
media, there's parts of American history we just wouldn't know because mainstream narratives didn't cover them.
Let's
So
talk about that for a minute
yeah.
because a lot of people think that we're in the post-racial era. They're like, why do we need ethnic media or Black media anymore? Tell us why. And I'm going to give you my look on it, my take.
Yeah, no, this is a really good question. And especially with what happened in this past year with the death of George Floyd and the resulting racial reckoning, and everyone trying to diversify and tell more
Mhm.
stories about communities that they had overlooked for centuries. Um, there was this conversation that kind of rises up that, like, well, if mainstream newsrooms actually get it right and serve these communities well, is there a need for the Black press anymore? Is there a need for Latino press or Asian press? And so we actually commissioned some research ourselves to try to understand what is the power of Black press. So it was comparing the content of Black media to mainstream media over from March 2020 to through May 2021.
Okay.
And we saw a few things. And one of the biggest things is that in terms of certain conversations, especially in rising up racial disparities, Black press um, was doing it first. They
Mhm.
were doing it more. They were talking about topics that were important to Black communities more. So we see spikes, for example, in Black press talking about Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery.
Mhm.
Um, they talked about it way more, and they also talked about it before mainstream media caught up to
Mm.
understanding how that tied into the story of George
Because
Floyd.
very often there is a lag of several months, isn't
There,
there?
yeah, there is. And so we see in some of these, there actually was a lag, even though they knew these stories at the same time. I mean, George Floyd was such a moment that it actually did peak at the same
Mhm.
time within,
Mhm.
mainstream and Black newsrooms. But even in that, we see how Black media contextualizes what is happening in the modern day to, Jim Crow, to slavery.
Mhm.
We're seeing Black newsrooms talk about COVID and racial disparities. We're seeing them talk about vaccine hesitancy um, and tying it back to the history in
Mhm.
Tuskegee. We're seeing them talk about
Well, it makes more sense. Yeah.
right. So you understand as opposed to what happens with some of these other narratives where you have like Texas Lieutenant Governor blaming Black folks for why we can't get past COVID, when it's like, that's not true, right? So that's a really important part of Black media in the current day.
Mm-hmm.
But the point I was raising earlier is also really important, that they have an archive of our history that we really wouldn't have if it wasn't for them. Like this centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, what we have, the documentation we have about what happened then, all comes from Black people. Because when we look at the
and very quickly, one sentence explaining what that is for maybe young people who aren't aware.
Yes. So the Tulsa Race Massacre was, so there was a neighborhood in Tulsa that, was a thriving Black community. They called it Black Wall Street. And a white mob came, burned it down, killed a bunch of people, and destroyed it. And so for a long time, the mainstream newspapers, everyone tried to erase that history. So much to the point where if you look at the archives of the paper from that day, there's actually a story missing that was originally there about this race massacre. So really, between the accounts that, Black folks in that town did to the newspapers, that's why we know what happened there.
That is amazing. I didn't know it was that bad.
Yeah. So Black press is critical both for helping us to understand our past and helping us use that past to understand the contemporaneous things happening in society.
Okay, I just wanted to add just one quick thing. I called my friend 𝗦𝗫𝗪𝗧𝗘. We met at WNCU, is where I got my start here in Durham, and he does the funk show. So I called him to tell him how much I enjoyed his show from a couple of weeks ago. He had like a Latin flavored show a couple of weeks ago, and then I mentioned to him our conversation that we're having now, and I said, I'm going to mention you, Howard, because I proofread a chapter or two from a book that he's writing. He's really interested in North Carolina militia, military, that sort of thing, from the Black perspective.
Yes.
He had all of this evidence, quotations from the different newspapers, from the Spanish-American War. We're talking about 1898.
Right.
Okay, where the Black people back then, it sounds crazy to me, but Black people back then really wanted to prove themselves as Americans and as worthy citizens, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the Black men volunteered to serve the United States, to fight in the wars. So I think Howard was telling me that they were, I forget the word he used, but let go, returning home in 1899. He said in the mainstream media, they were reporting marauding groups of drunken Negroes in the trains, smoking cigars and accosting women and all that kind of stuff. And then the Black newspapers were saying how the women were running up to the trains with delicately presented lunches in little boxes with bows tied, and how they would kiss goodbye and how sweet it was. And they were having like little picnics. The kids were saying, hello or goodbye, depending on which train, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So anyway, the difference was astonishing.
Yeah.
Where the white press was saying, now, if the Black people were really marauding and shooting guns in public and all that kind of stuff, they probably would not have gotten away with that. But that's what they were presenting in the news.
Right.
Two completely opposite stories.
Absolutely.
So it's not anything new. It's not, some people might think, it's since civil rights that Black people have been maligned in the press. No, it's ever since, at least as far as Howard's research has shown, since the Spanish-American War.
Even further than that, I was just reading on Friday the Freedom Journal, which is the first Black press, first Black newspaper in the country. And literally several times they point out, because their first article is like, we need to explain who we are because we're doing something different. So let me tell you why we exist and what we're trying to do. And they say a bunch of things, which is really incredible to read. I recommend everyone just read it when you get some time. But one of the things that they say is like, we need to tell our own stories because we've been maligned by the media in so many ways. So this has been happening, and that was in 1837. So I mean, it's been happening,
Wow.
for so long. I mean, Black press is about 200 years old. So the phenomena of us pushing back using
Mhm.
narrative is new, but also very storied, kind of in the landscape of American history.
That's amazing. So obviously, the Black press is very important, and I would suspect that the Latino press is
Absolutely.
equally as important to their
Absolutely.
community. Asian press, Native American, First Nations
Absolutely.
press as well.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the things that we talk about on our team quite a bit is about how how community media helps to preserve culture and cultural identity, right? So, especially for groups that immigrate, there's a certain amount that is lost over
Mm,
generations of, assimilating into kind of the American culture.
mhm,
And so there's a preservation that happens with community media that we really don't see if it
mhm,
doesn't exist. And I know we had a conversation with a Native woman last week, and she was like, we look at stories as resources,
mm.
because that is one of the few ways that we can keep our culture, retain our culture.
Wow.
And that's something that, this mainstream culture can't take from us. So,
Mhm,
it's not like we're doing stories to create resources. Stories are our resource. They're the way we keep our culture. So, and I
mhm.
think that's the case for all community media and why it matters so much.
This is so exciting. I love talking about the media.
Mm.
Now, I wonder, I did read back in the economic downturn, 2008 in that area. I was reading an article that said that the Black media and the ethnic media were doing so much better than the mainstream because of the relations that they were having in the community. And so they were always backed by the community. They never really faltered in terms of losing a lot of advertising like the mainstream media did. So that's probably true. But I'm wondering, how are we faring now because of
I think,
COVID?
yeah, it's a complicated like answer, because even the premise that Black media or community media was doing better is kind of based off of a faulty foundation. And the faulty foundation is that community media was never getting the advertising dollars that it
Oh,
should get in comparison to the
gotcha.
audiences they serve. And just to give you an example, in New York City with the city
Mhm,
advertising, um, uh, advertising spending, when we did an audit of it in like 2013, we found that only 13% of the city's advertising dollars went to community media.
that's all.
Um, yeah, in New York City, right? One of the most diverse
Okay. Oh my
places in the
God.
world. And we actually could show that when you look at the combined audiences of these community papers, they're actually larger than the mainstream outlets. So it's really, really
Wow.
abysmal. So I can say that that stat may be true, but it's based off of like assuming that everyone's starting from an equal place, and we're
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
But with COVID, um, I think they're really a tale of two type of media organizations. So there are some who it was tough, right? This was a really, really tough period. If you were subsisting off of local advertising, that becomes really difficult. If
Hmm.
the local spot closes down and can't serve any food, or and there are people who came up with really creative solutions of how to do that.
Sure.
But it's hard, because especially for free papers who get advertising dollars based off of how many papers they print, where they put them, who pulls
Hmm.
them out. We're not going to the church anymore. We're not going here.
Right.
We're not. How do I keep my circulation? How do I? So there are a lot of challenges, and with just the business model in COVID. Some people coped with it. Some people
Mhm.
had a more difficult time.
Sure.
But some people did really well, because one thing that did happen, because it was an emergency, there was a lot of this emergency funding that started to become
Right.
available. And so
Mhm.
for people who were savvy and could figure out ways in, it actually ended up being maybe their best year because
Okay.
between the convergence of COVID-19 and the social justice movement that emerged post the death of George Floyd, there were dollars for Black companies that just wasn't there
Mhm.
before the
Mhm.
pandemic. So I think it's kind of so, a little bit of both.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, and I mean, there's a lot of different types of media outlets, like you said. I bet there's quite a few, I don't know how many, of people like me, just ordinary citizens who
Yeah.
just kind of decide to become a journalist. No training. I shouldn't say no training, because I do attend a lot of workshops and stuff
Absolutely.
in fact, I hope you're able to list some of the resources that you probably work with. But I'll say self-taught, and
Yes.
uh, yeah, that kind of. But anyway, there's a lot of people like me who really try to cover the news and really need the advertising. Now, in my case, I've been living without advertising. I just now started collecting from my advertisers this month,
Wow.
because I just couldn't see trying to collect during COVID. I mean, so many places were shut down, and you
Yeah.
know, so yeah, it's a struggle. However, being online is, to me, the saving grace. I did start out with a paper newspaper,
Yeah.
and if I had to pay for printing, and yeah, that would have probably killed me.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
printing when times are good is expensive and hard to manage. It's
yeah,
not easy. Printing is expensive. Um, and then delivery is expensive. So it's
yes.
already difficult, but when you're not having ads, it becomes even more difficult. But you're
Mhm.
absolutely right, Pat. Most of I shouldn't say most. I would say probably like 40 to 50% of the people I talk to or just concerned citizens
Mhm.
who were like, we're not getting the information we need,
Right.
and started some sort of information providing. And I'm not a journalist either. So at least, not classically trained. So,
Mhm.
I respect that.
I
And
like that, classically trained.
yeah,
Yes.
that's what I like to say, because I mean, I always like to just remind folks that, like, with the death of George Floyd, the reason that that became a moment was not because a journalist was there. It was because a 17-year-old girl saw what was happening and chose to document that moment, chose to commit an act
That
of
was
journalism,
amazing. Yeah.
right? And she got a Pulitzer
How
citation
about that,
because
huh?
of it. So in any case, I think, I want people to be encouraged that you don't have to have a journalism degree
Mm,
to serve the information needs of your community.
definitely. Now, we have seen the death of other Black people, by the hands of the police before. I think George Floyd was unique in that it was done so casually.
Yeah.
He was so indifferent, like, oh, yeah, just killing this guy, no problem. That's, I think, what shocked everyone. If there had been a struggle, or maybe if he had been running away, we've seen that too. That still would have been shocking. But I think just the callousness, he was so casual about it. I
Yeah.
think that struck it. It just it was too much to watch. It was just too much.
Yeah, I've
He was
still
uncaring.
not watched. I still
Yeah,
haven't watched the
I haven't
video.
watched the whole thing. Just a few seconds was enough.
Yeah, and it was enough, right? And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, and additionally, it was a unique time because people didn't have anything to do. There weren't any sports. There
Mhm.
wasn't any like new live TV. By that point, we were in the point of the pandemic. Like, what else is there on Netflix? When is something new coming out?
Right. But people are
And
hyper focused on it.
right, you couldn't look away. Like, you
Mhm.
couldn't escape it in the ways that we usually could. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think there were a lot of things that played into that.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the Center for Community Media. It's in New York, and you do say you're expanding beyond New York. I do have some notes from your website that you have the Advertising Boost Initiative. You kind of described that already, helping
Yeah.
access advertising funds. Um, Now, the City Elections Initiative sounds interesting, and that is sharing information about candidates, I suppose, and getting
Yeah.
finding again advertising revenue from candidates and whatnot.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I should note, just like to tie the ribbon on the Advertising Boost Initiative, we worked with publishers and things like that to get that percentage increase from 13% to 50%. And it's now codified into
Oh,
law that 50% of those advertising dollars in the city have to go to community media.
nice!
So,
Congratulations.
yeah, no, I
That's
can't take any credit
amazing.
for it. The team is absolutely incredible. So yeah, that's awesome. But the city's election initiative was, just like you said, was really aiming to figure out how we can get additional dollars to community publishers for elections.
Hmm.
And so we did some work to find, the right contacts at all of the different um, campaigns. And if you know
Hmm.
anything about the New York election this year, it was a doozy. Everybody was running. There were a million campaigns here
Oh,
today,
I
going
can
tomorrow.
imagine.
It was a bit of a mess. Um, so um, so yeah, so that's really what we did. Give people the tools to be able to connect
Hmm.
with the campaigns and be able to, secure some advertising, and we saw some success with that. We
Nice.
have a report that hopefully will be coming out in the next few weeks about what worked well, what we think will should be improved for other people trying to copy the
Hmm.
initiative and things like that.
Nice. Does New York have an organization? Durham has an organization called Kids Voting Durham,
Hmm.
where literal kids, young people, put together the candidates guide.
Oh, nice.
Every whenever it's time to vote, they come out with this wonderful where they ask pointed questions of the candidates, and they publish this. It's just incredible. Does New York have something like that?
Not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm just
I
not
think
aware
Kids
of it.
Voting is a national organization. Of course, ours is Kids Voting Durham. There probably is a Kids Voting New York, and they who knows, they might be doing that same work unheralded. Maybe somebody needs to look them up and see
Yeah,
what they're up to.
absolutely. Yeah, I just haven't heard of them. That doesn't mean they don't exist. So,
Okay.
yeah, I have to look into that.
Okay. So you talked about the Latino Media Initiative and the Black Media Initiative, and something's coming up this Thursday. Is it okay to mention it? The
Oh,
Black
yeah.
Media Initiative Exchange.
Yes.
So tell us about that and who's invited.
Sure. So the Black Media Initiative is really focused on how we can support Black-owned media
Mhm.
to have the capacity they do to be financially sustainable and do their best work. Because we know once you have the money, you can do, the great content.
Mhm.
And it's kind of a vicious cycle. So we had some conversations, and we designed based on the conversations with some Black publishers. We decided to create a space where Black publishers can talk to each other about different
Ooh.
topics related to um, financial sustainability. So,
Mhm.
what are all of the revenue models that Black publishers are using? What's working well? What's not working as well? What do Black publishers need to think about when choosing these different paths to go down and what to
Mhm.
do? Because, as with so many things in Black life, access has been a really hard thing, getting the access to
Mhm.
the information to make these informed choices. So the event on Thursday is really going to focus on organizational models. So, how do you decide whether to be a for profit newsroom, a nonprofit newsroom? There are some other models as well.
Mhm.
But those are obviously the big two. And there's this big movement toward having a nonprofit newsroom.
Yeah,
Um,
that's really popular right now, isn't it?
it is, and it's growing, especially because of the revenue stream of grant making
Mhm.
in news, and that most grant makers only give to nonprofits. But there's
Mhm.
also this, there is a reason why community media in general and Black media in particular wants to own
Mhm.
the things that they're creating. And there's like a real conversation that we need to have around that. It's not just as black and white as, you go this way or that way.
Mhm.
There are some other things that come into play about why we want to own and be able to have a legacy to pass
Mhm.
down.
Awesome. So that's going to be this Thursday, 2 o'clock Eastern.
Yes.
So how do people, Black media outlets, how do they connect and how can they attend if it's not full
Absolutely.
already?
Yeah, no, it's not full.
Okay.
So if you are interested, please just email me. It's hard to, I mean, we have, or you can sign up for the newsletter at the Center for Community Media, and we'll send out an invite as well. So either way will work, but you kind of have to be in the circle to be able to access it because we have had some Zoom bombing and stuff, and we just want to, be cautious.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yes.
I've
Yeah.
heard about those. Now, I'm sure people like me, one person operations, will be very excited to attend to learn more about how to stay afloat, basically.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hope so. I hope it'll just, help people to hear different experiences to be able to make some choices for themselves.
Okay. Now, I know you're in charge of the Black Media Initiative, but I did see this on your website. So
Yeah.
I have to ask you about the regional hubs. I see there's one in my hometown in Chicago, and it looks here that your partner in Chicago is the Chicago Independent Media Alliance.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think I moved here to North Carolina before they got started, I believe, because that's not a familiar. The big organization when I was still in Chicago was the community media workshop out of Columbia College. I
Mm,
don't know if they still exist. I don't
I'm
know.
not sure. Yeah, I mean, so the regional hubs that we have, it's us working with regional partners to figure out ways that
Mhm.
we can provide resources there.
Right.
Um, it's something that it's kind of on a case by case basis as things come up.
Okay.
So yeah, so SEMA, I think, is a fairly new organization.
Okay.
And so, yeah, but they are a group that comes together and figure out ways to organize and bring resources by bringing the collective of all of the independent outlets in Chicago together to raise
That is
funds and get advertising dollars and things like that. And we're seeing these
so nice
movements
to hear.
in different cities throughout the country
Mhm.
because, it's hard when you're an outlet that may be serving like 6,000 people really
Mhm.
well. It's hard to get advertising dollars. But when you're starting to talk about a network of, 5 or 10 publishers who each
Mhm.
has 6,000 people, then you can go to advertisers and have a little bit more heft to the conversation and are able to get more conversation that way. So that's really, organizations like SEMA and other places are really trying
Okay.
to leverage the collective power of community media.
I love the sound of that. I do
Yeah.
know that you have a hub in LA, in Los Angeles as well.
Yes.
Maybe one day you'll have something here in the Triangle area.
Yeah, well, we really work with people like bottom up organized organizations. So we don't like go in and create anything. They already
Oh, okay.
exist. And then we figure out ways to partner and provide support. So SEMA is its own organization that we
Mhm.
just have a partnership with. Same in LA with Media and Color.
Awesome. So, what do you think is the future of not just Black media, but also Latino? Because I think the fastest growing group in the United States still Hispanic slash Latino
Oh
folk.
yeah.
So, being from Chicago, I mean, I just knew people from so many different Latino groups. So they're so different. They're not all the same at all.
Absolutely.
Whereas here in North Carolina, they're still not all pretty much the same, but for the most part, we have a lot of people from Mexico and Honduras. A
Hmm.
lot of them work either construction
Hmm.
or in the smaller cities or smaller areas, rural areas, agriculture.
Yeah.
And then we have northern Latinos from like New York and I'll say Chicago, maybe a few from Chicago I've met. Mostly when I meet people who are Latino, they're from New York, the New York area,
Hmm.
Delaware, New
Yeah.
Jersey, stuff like that. But in Chicago, there's so many different, and I'm sure in New York as well. So I can
Definitely.
imagine their media is probably, I mean, I have I have read about so many Latino groups that are like Republican because they're like of Cuban descent or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I'm used to most black people being Democratic.
Right.
But even that's not true anymore. You know that.
No, that's not true. Right.
And
Yeah.
I'll bet there's a lot more diversity in the Hispanic area. So how do you think their publications are going to fare in the near future?
I think you're right with all of these communities. There's so much diversity,
Mhm.
and so much richness. I think community media will be similar to mainstream media, but I think in certain ways it's off to a better start. I think
Hmm.
the future of media organizations is really understanding the community you're trying to serve
Hmm.
and serving them well, because so much of the model is now shifting to much more of readers or viewers or whoever engaging and helping to support the work in addition to advertisers and things like that. There's no
Hmm.
longer kind of like a for most people, if you're depending on how small you are, you may be able to have enough advertising to
Hmm.
survive. But for most people, they need some support from the community who likes the content. So, community media already has does this pretty well,
Hmm.
because they are entrenched in community. They are usually it's a community member starting the publication, based out of a need. And so
Definitely.
I
I mean,
think,
that's why I got started. I got started in Chicago because I had moved back to Woodlawn, the neighborhood that I was born in. So I couldn't afford to buy a house where I
yeah,
grew up in Chatham. So I went back to Woodlawn and discovered, oh, by then it was considered a low income area, which is
mm,
fine. I was low income too, and
yeah,
no problem. So,
mhm,
but I noticed that there was no newspaper. Chicago
mm,
neighborhoods are known for their newspapers.
right,
And that's why I got started because we didn't have one in Woodlawn. And also, the people there, I could tell they didn't have the information they needed.
yeah.
And
Information
how to get
is
the information to the
power.
people.
Yeah,
So,
it, it's important. Having information is really really critical. So I think, yeah, I think that's the future. People being able to really serve communities
mm.
well. Um,
I wonder if what defines ethnic media will change because even though I'm obviously black, but
mhm,
even when I was in Chicago in Woodlawn, which is a black community, I never really restricted myself in that way. Not that that's restrictive because I grew up a big fan of Jet,
yeah,
Ebony, Latin New York magazine, all
yeah,
that. But I always aimed my publication for whoever was in the area.
yep,
So although I started out in Woodlawn, which was all black, when I expanded it to Hyde Park and other areas, um, it hopefully appealed to whoever was living in those areas. And I'm
mhm,
the same way now.
yeah,
I'm here in Durham and I'm black,
yeah,
but the Durham Skywriter is for Durhamites.
that's right.
However, when I was in Chicago and and the school board wanted to meet with the black press, I was first in line. Not gonna
Wow.
lie.
Yeah,
So I'm not sure where I fit in.
I've had a few people, like, when I was having initial conversations with the Black Media Initiative, bring this point up, because one of
Mhm.
the first questions I ask people is like, how would you define Black media? Um, and the definition that we've landed on, for our initiative is just Black ownership or Black
Oh,
control if
good.
it's a
Okay.
nonprofit. It's not actually about whether the what's produced is strictly for black folks or if it's for
Okay.
a more mainstream audience. And we wrestled with this,
Mhm.
because there were a lot of people who said no, it has to be by black for black.
Mhm.
um,
I
but
understand that.
then
I can
but
see that too.
but within the same vein, we know black founders in general have unique challenges,
Mhm.
that it doesn't matter what audience you're trying to serve, there are some challenges that will
Mhm.
remain
Mhm.
the same. And so, most of the organizations are by Black people for Black people, but
Mhm.
there's a decent minority of publications within the Black Media Initiative that are like, oh no, we serve all people of color, or no, we just serve the people in this neighborhood.
Mhm.
I don't care if it changes, right now
Mhm.
it's majority Black, but if it changes tomorrow and is
Mhm.
like, mainly Hispanic or mainly white, you're going to see that reflected in the coverage.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that is a shift that is occurring, at least for
Okay.
us. I don't think it is for everyone, but it is for us.
Okay. I guess I developed my attitude because even though Woodlawn is a low income area, that doesn't mean everybody was. I mean, we had a lawyer across the street. We had successful, what's
Yeah,
considered successful people in the community.
yeah.
Doesn't mean everybody's on welfare. And what I noticed with a lot of the publications in low income areas, it was always from the perspective of getting information to people who were needy, which is important. However, they didn't seem to acknowledge the people who wanted to also help.
Hmm.
And I thought those people were being overlooked in the low income areas. On the other hand, I have seen publications from the high and middle income areas that um, seem to think, or the perspective was, everybody is successful and there's no information for people who needed help.
Yeah,
And there's Section 8 in the higher income areas as well.
absolutely.
So I think that's why I developed that attitude, because I have lived both in Chatham and Woodlawn and in between, where, you have low income neighbors and high income neighbors, and there's so many different needs within each community. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
okay. It's so exciting to talk with you. I hope we talk again. I know that you did mention over the phone, if you don't
Yeah.
mind my divulging this information, even though on Thursday, during the Black Media Initiative Exchange, we'll be talking about, I'm saying we because I'm coming,
Yes, right.
talking about income and staying afloat, and
Yeah.
your how you arrange or present your business. But also later, you said we'll be tackling issues such as content,
Yes,
which I think is
absolutely.
of utmost importance. I think that's really going to be extremely exciting.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And the research that I talked about earlier is one part of that. And being able to we're going to be having a town hall discussion with Black media around
Mhm.
that, because um, we did it. I mean, we didn't do like a full analysis of like what does the consumer say they want in comparison, and like what are we providing. But what
Mhm.
we see is that the topics that are of significant importance to the Black community, Black press is talking about it. Things that disproportionately affect Black folks,
Mhm.
Black press is talking about it. One of the things we found was that Black press covers health a lot more than
Mm.
mainstream press. Black media talks about family a lot more than me, or uses the word family much more
Mm.
often than
Okay.
mainstream press. Black media talks about children a lot more than mainstream press. Um, and at least in this time period that we covered, which is over a year. So
Mhm.
yeah, so it's there's a lot, I think, to unpack there in terms of not in a bad way, but like in a great way to
Mhm.
understand what is the power of Black press and how do we leverage that even more. So yeah, definitely more content things to come. We also want to figure out if there are ways we can support some content sharing, some
Mhm.
additional content creation, and things like that, and cross pollination between publishers. So all of
That
that is
sounds
in
great, like, maybe, like, infographics and story ideas and things like that.
Absolutely. And I know some of the publishers I talked to were like, if there's like a regional story, like, can we all work together and publish together so we're making a bigger impact, or whatever it might be. So, I think
I think some Black press is doing that. I can't remember the name of the organization, but
so.
I do remember when I was visiting my great aunt
Yeah.
in the Bronx, I picked up an Amsterdam News,
Yep.
and I saw, when I got back home, a couple of the same stories in the Chicago Crusader.
Yeah, yeah. There is an initiative right now going on called 𝗦𝗬𝗪𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗧, which is 10 of the biggest Black publishers throughout the country who are working together to produce original content that goes throughout all of their papers, and they do events, and they're using it again like an initiative to kind of have like a national Black owned, news organization that also can, bring in revenue and things like that and build a brand. So it's really exciting. I'm excited to see how that continues to emerge. I know eventually they'll be adding in more publishers as well. So
I definitely want to hear more about that. For
yeah,
sure.
they're doing some really, really interesting and incredible work. So yeah, it's something to keep your eyes on.
Wow. I want to thank you so much, Cheryl, for coming on the show. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to take you off camera, but I'm going to end the show. But stay tuned because I'm going to have a couple of words with you when we're done. But do you have any last minute shout outs to anyone at CUNY or in the media of New York or anywhere? Family, friends?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I just shout out to the Center for Community Media and the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, who really believes in community media. Like I said, it brought in this organization at a time when otherwise it may just have ceased to exist. And shout out to our dean, Sarah Bartlett, who has really been a champion for community media and pushing the conversation forward. Shout out to all of the organizations supporting Black media throughout the country. There are a ton of them, and they all are doing really important work.
That reminds me, name a couple of the really cool organizations like the Knight Foundation is one. And name a couple more, because I know they have like these different workshops. Do you have
Absolutely. So, there are organizations focused on Black media, such as the National Newspaper Publisher Association or the National
That's the
Association.
organization that the Amsterdam News and Chicago Crusader belong to. That's the one.
Because NNPA, the acronym, they have a news wire. So, and they've had a news wire for a long time. They actually had a news wire that was the first to say that the U.S. is lying about what happened in Hiroshima. Atomic bombs are problematic, when the U.S. was still lying about the effects of the atomic bomb.
I didn't even know.
Yeah, there's a New York Times article about like the way that that newswire actually broke the story when all the other news outlets were accepting the U.S. propaganda.
I didn't know.
So they're awesome. They've been in existence for a long time, and they've been doing the great work. The National Association of Broadcasters, of Black-owned broadcasters, they're doing great work. They have great workshops. I learned so much in those workshops, so that's great. In California, there's the California Black Media, who's doing a lot of things to get advertising dollars in. That is really interesting. In terms of funders, the Knight Foundation is, the biggest investor, I think, in journalism in the country. So you should always be on the lookout for them.
They have wonderful workshops, incredible.
Yeah, they do some great stuff. Democracy Fund is another great funder, and the Ford Foundation, but there are also organizations that do great trainings, like the local independent online publishers, Lion Publishers is what they're called. They do a lot of things for entrepreneurial journalists trying to figure out the ropes. And, things like for folks like Pat or other folks who are like one person newsroom, there's a project called the Tiny News Desk, I think is what it's called.
I didn't hear about that. Okay.
Yeah, they are doing some supports for people who have like one person, two person newsrooms. So be on the lookout for them, because they're trying to figure out how to support a model where one or two people can make, can do this sustainably and take care of themselves while doing it. So yeah, there's so many. Also, I have to shout out my school, Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. We have a
Okay.
lot of wonderful trainings. Some of them are online for free. So, if you look into the J Plus section of the site, they have video classes, some of which are absolutely free.
Okay.
And then they have like some other things like entrepreneurial trainings, which they give a ton of scholarships for. So, there's a lot out there.
There's a
But this
lot. I'm
really
also a big fan of the NABJ,
yes,
National Association of Black Journalists, and ONA, Online News Association.
absolutely.
And there's
There's
another
so
one.
many, the Society of Professional Journalists. And,
Right, right.
I mean, we could go on and on and on in the best way possible. There are a lot of resources out here. So the world is your oyster in terms of that. You can find what you're looking for pretty much in anything. One other organization I should have noted earlier is a new organization called the Pivot Fund. And it is being started by a woman who used to run the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. And so she's starting a venture philanthropy fund, raising money to be able to give out to publishers of color. And she also is doing trainings. Right now, her trainings are focused on board development, how you build out a board to be able to raise funds and the importance a board plays in being able to raise funds. So
So
another
that's for
organization.
nonprofit news outlets then.
Well,
Right.
for profits too, because like when you're looking for grants, or when you're looking for investment or certain things like that, your board becomes more important because people want to see oversight and how their money is being spent. But that's a whole nother conversation. We don't have to get into that.
Obviously, you're going to have to come back.
Well, I'd love to come back anytime, Pat. You just tell me when.
Absolutely. Cheryl Thompson-Morton, thank you so much for being on the show. I welcome you back. Again, I'm going to, talk with you after the show, but I'm going to thank you again. And thumbs up. I love what you all are doing, and I hope to get really involved as a participant and fan, member, whatever. And you're going to hear from me for sure.
I hope to. We're in this together, Pat. Thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. You take care.
You too.
Boy, oh boy, was that great. That was so fun. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for being on the show. If you want to learn more, I do have the link for the Center for Community Media. Note that they are in New York, but they are expanding. Not everything that they do is, of course, restricted to New York. So find out about that by going online, checking out their website. And about TV Skywriter, if you'd like to be a guest, just let me know. You can find me on Twitter, Durham Skywriter. I do a daily show called Bull City Hangout from the Durham Skywriter Facebook page. You can drop in. Again, you don't have to be in or from Durham. You can just drop in and promote yourself on Bull City Hangout. It's also a sneaky way to get in practice being in front of the camera. A lot of people are really nervous about being on camera. There's really nothing to it because with a show like mine, with Bull City Hangout at least, if you mess up, and nobody's ever messed up, nobody's going to see it past that day because nobody watches yesterday's show. So I'm encouraging you to come on Bull City Hangout and hang out and try your hand at being on camera. And with that, I'm going to end the show and stop gabbing. So I do hope to hear from you. Be sure to read the Durham Skywriter if you want to see an all-positive community paper online. It's durhamskywriter.com, and that's news and information for Durham, North Carolina. So I will see you real soon. Ciao for now.